wagon she rode into his clearing. Abigail, the kind of woman men ruined themselves over wearing a velvet riding coat now destroyed by miles of sharp pine and mud. She didn't scream. She didn't ask for water. She just swung down from her exhausted mare, looked the loneliest man in the territory dead in the eye, and said, "Marry me." Wind howled through the jagged teeth of Iron Peak, carrying the sharp scent of crushed pine and incoming snow. Caleb swung the splitting maul. The heavy iron head bit through a round of seasoned oak with a dry, violent crack. He tossed the split halves onto a pile that was already taller than he was. Winter up here didn't negotiate. You either bled into the dirt to prepare for it, or it buried you. He was 34 years old, though the sun and the biting cold had carved lines into his face that made him look 10 years older. His beard was thick, catching wood chips and frost. He wore a heavy canvas coat stained with elk grease and campfire ash. Caleb liked the quiet. He liked that the mountain didn't ask anything of him that he couldn't answer with his hands. Down in the valley, in the sprawling, prosperous town of Oak Haven, men dealt in smiles, handshakes, and slow knives in the back. Caleb preferred the honest brutality of a grizzly bear or a blizzard. Rust, a hound missing half its left ear, suddenly lifted his head from his spot by the cabin steps. A low, rolling growl rattled in the dog's chest. Caleb leaned on the handle of his maul. He didn't reach for the Winchester leaning against the chopping block yet. He just listened. Beneath the wind, he caught it, the irregular, heavy rhythm of hooves. A horse climbing the switchbacks. It was a brutal trail, steep and washed out from the autumn rains. Whoever was forcing an animal up that grade was either out of their mind running from a posse or profoundly lost. Through the tree line, a horse broke into the clearing. It was a beautiful chestnut mare, but it was lathered in white sweat, its chest heaving desperately. And then Caleb saw the rider. It wasn't a bandit. It wasn't a lost prospector. It was a woman. She wore a dark blue velvet riding habit, the kind of garment meant for manicured park paths, not the merciless timberline of the Rockies. The fabric was torn at the hem, caked in yellow mud and burrs. Her matching hat was gone. Her dark hair had escaped its pins, whipping wildly around a face pale with cold and exhaustion. Caleb recognized her. Everyone in the territory knew who she was, even men who hadn't stepped foot in town for 3 years. Abigail Miller, the daughter of the late cattle baron Arthur Miller. She was widely considered the most beautiful woman in Oak Haven, a porcelain doll, kept high in a sprawling mansion overlooking the valley. Men fought in the streets for a glance from her. They bought new suits and built fortunes just to stand a chance at her parlor door. Caleb frowned. His grip on the maul tightened. Abigail pulled back on the reins. The mare stopped trembling violently. For a long moment, the mountain man and the heiress just stared at each other across the 20 yards of frozen dirt. Caleb didn't say a word. He didn't offer a hand. The silence stretched heavy and tense, broken only by the whistling wind. She threw her leg over the saddle and slid down. The moment her boots hit the uneven ground, her knees buckled. She didn't fall. She caught herself on the stirrup leather, her knuckles going white. She took a ragged breath, straightened her spine, and let go of the horse. She walked toward him. Every step looked painful. Her leather boots were thin, useless against the cold. As she got closer, Caleb saw the details the distance had hidden. Her nose was red. Her lips were cracked. Her eyes, a striking deep hazel, weren't the soft, fluttery eyes of a pampered socialite. They were hard. They held the flat, calculating stare of a cornered wolf. She stopped 3 feet from the chopping block. She looked at the maul, then up at his scarred face. "Caleb," she said. Her voice was raspy, stripped of its usual polished cadence. He didn't confirm or deny his name. He just waited. "My horse needs water," she said, "and I need a husband. Marry me." Caleb stared at her. He didn't laugh. He didn't blink. He slowly reached up and pulled a splinter of oak from his beard, flicking it into the dirt. He looked past her, down the treacherous trail she had just conquered, scanning for trailing riders. There were none. "You've got the wrong mountain, Miss Miller," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp, a muscle rarely used. "Town's a 5-hour ride back down. You better leave before the sun drops, or that mare will freeze to death." "I am not going back down there unwed," Abigail stated. She crossed her arms, shivering violently as a gust of wind tore across the clearing. "I am perfectly serious. I have a proposal. A business arrangement." "I don't do business," Caleb said. He bent down, picked up a split log, and tossed it onto the pile. "Especially not with people from Oakhaven. Drink from the trough, then ride." "If I ride back down that mountain today, I lose everything," Abigail said, stepping closer. The smell of expensive lilac water mixed with the sharp scent of horse sweat. "And you lose $5,000. Caleb paused. His hand hovered over another log. $5,000. Out here a man could live 3 lifetimes on that. He could buy the deed to Iron Peak. He could buy peace. He straightened up, finally looking at her directly. She was shaking so hard he could hear her teeth clicking together, yet she held her chin high, refusing to break eye contact. It was the most absurd, desperate display of pride he had ever seen. "You're freezing," he said flatly. "I'm aware. Get inside, before you die on my property and I have to dig a hole." He didn't wait to see if she followed. Caleb grabbed his Winchester, whistled for Rust, and walked toward the heavy timber door of his cabin. The cabin was a single large room, built strictly for survival. The walls were chinked with mud and dried moss. A massive stone fireplace dominated the far wall, where a low fire cast long, dancing shadows across the floorboards. The ceiling was hung with dried herbs, curing tobacco, and pelts of fox and beaver. It smelled intensely of wood smoke, old leather, and pine needles. Caleb walked to the hearth, tossed a fresh log onto the embers, and used an iron poker to stir the flames. He didn't look at Abigail as she stepped inside and shut the heavy door against the wind. She stood near the entrance, looking entirely out of place. The delicate blue velvet of her dress clashed violently with the brutal, rough-hewn reality of the cabin. She peeled off her riding gloves. Caleb noticed her hands. They were blistered and bleeding at the webbing of her fingers from gripping the reins too tightly. She had ridden hard and fast. He grabbed a tin cup from a shelf, poured black coffee from a soot-stained pot sitting on the stones, and set it on the small wooden table in the center of the room. "Drink," he ordered. Abigail walked over, wrapping her raw hands around the hot tin. She brought it to her lips and drank. The coffee was bitter, thick as sludge and scalding. She didn't flinch. She drank half of it before setting the cup down. "Thank you." She breathed, some color returning to her cheeks. Caleb pulled a chair out, a crude thing made of raw pine, and sat down, leaning his forearms on his knees. He looked at her. "Speak." Abigail took a deep breath, anchoring herself. "My father died 3 weeks ago. Heart failure." Caleb gave a slight nod. Arthur Miller had been a hard man, but fair in his own ruthless way. "I didn't know. No one expects you to. You haven't been seen in Oakhaven since the winter of '83, Abigail said. She pulled out a heavy, folded piece of parchment from inside her coat. "My father built Oakhaven. He owned the bank, the lumber mill, and 50,000 acres of grazing land. He left it all to me. Congratulations. With a condition." She countered, her voice hardening. "My father didn't believe a woman could manage a financial empire alone. He wrote an ironclad stipulation into his will. I must be married by my 25th birthday. If I am not the estate, the land, the money, everything goes into a trust managed by my cousin Eugene." "Eugene's a drunk," Caleb noted. "Eugene is an idiot," Abigail corrected sharply. "And he is heavily in debt to Elias Montgomery. If Eugene gets the estate, Montgomery gets the estate. Montgomery will strip the land, sell off the water rights, and turn Oakhaven into a company town. And I will be left with a small, humiliating stipend living in the attic of my own house." Caleb leaned back the wood of his chair, groaning. So marry someone. You've got 50 men in town who would shoot their own mothers to put a ring on your finger. That is exactly the problem. Abigail snapped, slamming her hand on the table. The sudden noise made Rust lift his head. She lowered her voice, a sudden raw exhaustion bleeding through her tough facade. They don't want me. They want the deed. If I marry Montgomery or the sheriff or any of those grinning vultures, I become property. A wife in name and ornament for their parlor while they take my inheritance and run it into the ground. I refuse. I will not trade one cage for another. Caleb studied her. The cynicism in him wanted to laugh. Here was a woman born with a silver spoon complaining about the taste. But there was genuine terror beneath her anger, the fear of a trapped animal. Why me? Caleb asked quietly. Abigail looked around the cabin. Because you hate Oakhaven as much as I do. Because you have no interest in running a bank or a cattle ranch. You just want to be left alone. She looked back at him, her hazel eyes intense. I need a ghost, Caleb. I need a signature on a piece of paper. We ride down, we stand before the magistrate, we say the words. Then I ride back to my house and you ride back up this mountain. You never have to sleep under my roof. You never have to attend a dinner party. You remain exactly as you are. And the 5,000, your compensation for the inconvenience, she said without hesitating. 2,000 tomorrow when the ink dries, 3,000 deposited into an account in Denver or wherever you want it by the end of the year. Caleb rubbed his jaw. The bristles scratched against his calloused palm. It was madness. It was tying himself to the very world he had walked away from. But the winter was coming. His roof needed patching. His traps were failing. The elk herds were moving further north. $5,000 meant he never had to worry about starving to death in the snow again. It meant complete, unassailable independence. The town won't like it, Caleb warned. Montgomery will try to tear up the paper. Let him try. My father's lawyers are bound by the letter of the will. A legal marriage is all it requires. She took a step toward him. I'm buying my freedom, Caleb. Will you sell me a piece of your name? Caleb stood up. He walked to the window, looking out at the fading light. The snow had started to fall, thin white flakes drifting past the glass. He had spent his life avoiding entanglements, surviving by keeping his circle small enough to fit inside this cabin. But he understood survival. And right now, Abigail Miller was surviving the only way she knew how. He turned around. I sleep by the fire. You take the cot. We ride down at first light. Abigail's shoulders dropped. A long, shuddering sigh escaped her lips. The steel in her spine bent just for a second before she stiffened again. Thank you. Don't thank me, Caleb muttered, walking past her to grab a wool blanket. We ain't married yet. The ride down the mountain the next morning was brutally quiet. The dawn brought a bitter frost that coated the pines in a layer of glass. Caleb rode a massive, ill-tempered roan gelding, leading Abigail's mare carefully down the treacherous switchbacks. As they descended, the biting cold of the timberline gave way to the damp, heavy chill of the valley. The scent of pine was replaced by the smell of wood smoke from hundreds of chimneys, the stench of unwashed horses and the metallic tang of the railroad. Oakhaven sprawled out below them, a festering wound of civilization built over the river valley. They hit the main street just past 10 in the morning. Oakhaven was bustling. Wagons rattled through the muddy thoroughfare. Men in bowler hats and heavy wool coats hurried along the boardwalks. Women clustered outside the dry goods store. The moment Caleb and Abigail rode past the first saloon, the noise began to die. It started as a ripple. A blacksmith stopped hammering. A parlor girl leaned over a balcony rail, wide-eyed. Shopkeepers stepped out of their doors. The clatter of the town faded into a thick, suffocating silence, broken only by the steady clop-clop of their horses' hooves in the mud. Caleb felt the weight of their stares. He kept his posture relaxed, his hands resting easily on the saddle horn, but his eyes tracked everything. He saw the shock, the disgust, the confusion. Caleb was a boogeyman to the townsfolk, a savage who lived in the dirt. And riding right beside him, her head held impossibly high, despite her ruined clothes, was their golden calf. "Don't look at them," Abigail whispered, staring straight ahead at the magistrate's office at the end of the street. "I have to," Caleb replied softly. "Someone's going to do something stupid." He wasn't wrong. As they approached the bank, a man stepped off the boardwalk and into the center of the muddy street, blocking their path. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit and a silver-tipped walking stick. Elias Montgomery. His face was a mask of furious disbelief. "Abigail!" Montgomery barked, his voice carrying down the quiet street. "What in God's name is the meaning of this? We've been looking for you since yesterday afternoon." Abigail pulled her mare to a halt. Caleb stopped his roan half a pace behind her, positioning his horse to block the angle from the alleyway. "I went for a ride, Elias," Abigail said. Her voice was ice. "You went for a ride." Montgomery sneered, his eyes darting to Caleb. He looked at Caleb the way a man looks at a dead dog in the road. "With this piece of mountain trash, get off that horse. Your cousin is frantic. We are going home." Montgomery stepped forward and reached out his gloved hand, grabbing the cheek strap of Abigail's mare. The horse tossed its head nervously. Before Montgomery could pull the horse forward, Caleb's roan stepped into the gap. Caleb leaned down from the saddle. He didn't pull his rifle. He didn't raise his voice. He simply placed his large, calloused, dirt-stained hand over Montgomery's perfectly manicured fingers. "Let go of the leather, friend," Caleb said. The words were quiet, but they carried the heavy, undeniable weight of a rock slide. Montgomery looked up at Caleb. He saw the scars. He saw the dead flat, calm in the mountain man's eyes. It was a look that promised violence without an ounce of hesitation. Montgomery swallowed hard, his face flushing crimson, and slowly pulled his hand away. "You don't belong here, trapper," Montgomery hissed, backing up a step. "Neither do you," Caleb replied. He looked at Abigail. "Let's go." They left Montgomery standing in the mud. Caleb could feel the banker's eyes burning holes into his back, but he didn't turn around. The magistrate's office smelled of stale tobacco and old paper. Magistrate Higgins, a bald, sweating man with ink-stained fingers, nearly choked on his coffee when Abigail Miller walked in with Caleb shadowing her. "Miss Miller, what can I do for you?" Higgins stammered, standing up so fast his chair tipped over. "We require a marriage license, Mr. Higgins," Abigail said, slapping a $20 gold piece onto the desk. "And we require you to perform the ceremony right now." Higgins looked from the gold piece to Abigail, then to the massive, silent man standing behind her. "Miss Miller, you can't be serious. This man, your father—" "My father is dead!" Abigail snapped, her patience completely evaporating. "And his will dictates I marry. I have chosen my groom. Do you have the authority to marry us, or do I need to find a preacher who likes gold more than you do?" Higgins swallowed right at his chair and pulled a heavy ledger from a drawer. He fumbled with his dip pen. "Names: Abigail Clare Miller. Caleb." She looked back at him. She didn't even know his last name. "Thatcher," Caleb said quietly. Caleb Thatcher. Higgins wrote it down, his hand shaking. The ceremony, if it could be called that, took less than 3 minutes. There were no flowers. There was no music. There was only the dusty sunlight cutting through the window, the scratching of a pen, and the smell of fear sweat from the magistrate. "Do you, Abigail, take this man?" "I do." "Do you, Caleb, take this woman?" Caleb looked at her. Her hands were still clenched into fists at her sides. She was holding her breath. "I do," Caleb said. "Sign here." Higgins squeaked, pushing the book towards them. Abigail signed with a swift, elegant flourish. Caleb took the pen. It felt small and fragile in his grip. He signed his name in blocky, uneven letters. "By the power vested in me by the territory," Higgins rushed out, I pronounce you husband and wife." It was done. The trap had snapped shut, though Caleb wasn't sure yet who was caught in it. They walked out onto the boardwalk. The crowd outside had doubled. People whispered behind their hands. Abigail ignored them. She reached into her coat and pulled out a heavy leather pouch, pressing it into Caleb's chest. It clinked with the heavy sound of coins. 2,000. She said softly, refusing to look at him, staring instead at the dusty planks of the boardwalk. "The rest goes to the Denver Bank as agreed." Caleb took the pouch. He should walk away. He should get on his horse ride out of this suffocating valley and never look back. He had what he wanted. "You're going back to the mansion?" he asked. "Yes. I have a meeting with my father's lawyers in an hour. I have to secure the estate before Montgomery tries to contest this." She finally looked up at him. The fierce independence was still there, but beneath it there was a profound, lingering loneliness. The kind of loneliness Caleb recognized in his own reflection. "It's just paper, Abigail." Caleb said, his voice softer than it had been since she arrived. "They won't stop just because you got a ring." "I know," she said, "but I have the high ground now." She turned and walked toward the livery to stable her horse, her ruined velvet skirts dragging in the Oakhaven dust. Caleb stood on the boardwalk, a heavy pouch of gold in his hand, feeling the hostile glares of the town washing over him. The mountain was calling him back. The cold, logical silence of Iron Peak was waiting. But as he watched his new wife walk away alone into a den of vipers, Caleb's boots felt unnaturally heavy. He didn't move toward his horse. The Miller mansion sat on a rise overlooking Oakhaven, like a judge presiding over the damned. It was a sprawling Victorian monstrosity of dark mahogany imported glass and iron wrought into sharp, unforgiving angles. To the town, it was a monument to success. To Abigail, it had always been a gilded cage. Today, it felt like a tomb. She sat at the head of the long dining table. The mahogany surface was polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the overcast grey light, filtering through the heavy drapes. Her hands, freshly bandaged in white linen by her maid, rested flat on the wood. The stinging pain in her raw palms kept her awake, kept her focused. Across from her sat Josiah Reed, her father's attorney. He was a thin, greying man who always looked as though he had just swallowed something sour. To his right slumped Eugene Abigail's cousin. Eugene's collar was unbuttoned, his face flushed with midday bourbon, his eyes darting nervously around the room. And standing by the fireplace, uninvited but unbothered, was Elias Montgomery. "It's a farce, Josiah," Montgomery said, staring at the flames. He didn't even look at Abigail. "The girl has lost her senses out of grief. Arthur would roll in his grave if he saw the animal she dragged down from the timberline. The will stipulates marriage, Elias," Josiah replied, adjusting his spectacles. He looked down at the freshly signed license resting on the table between them. "It does not stipulate the pedigree of the groom. The document is signed by Magistrate Higgins. It is legally binding." "Legally binding," Montgomery scoffed, finally turning around. He leaned against the stone mantel, holding a crystal tumbler of Arthur Miller's best scotch. "A piece of paper signed under duress by a frightened girl. Tell me, Abigail, has the marriage been consummated? Because if it hasn't, Judge Harrison can annul this little stunt before supper." My private life is none of your concern, Elias," Abigail said. Her voice was steady, but her heart hammered violently against her ribs. She was exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried her up the mountain and back down was rapidly draining, leaving behind a hollow, aching fatigue. "It is my concern when it affects the stability of this town's economy." Montgomery snapped, dropping the calm facade. He set his glass down hard on the mantel. "Your father built an empire. Eugene here is the rightful blood heir to manage it." "Eugene couldn't manage a 2-mule wagon," Abigail retorted, her hazel eyes locking onto her cousin. Eugene flinched, shrinking into his chair. He owes you thousands, Elias. If he takes control of the trust, he hands the bank, the mill, and the grazing rights directly to you to settle his debts. I know exactly what you are doing." Montgomery smiled. It was a thin, bloodless expression. "I am protecting investments. Oakhaven needs a firm hand, not a hysterical woman playing house with a mountain savage." He walked slowly towards the table, leaning his knuckles on the polished wood, bringing his face uncomfortably close to hers. "You think you've outsmarted me. You think paying off a drifter secures your throne. But a marriage of convenience is a fragile thing, Abigail. Men like that, they tend to wander off. Sometimes they get lost in the woods. Sometimes they just disappear." Abigail's breath hitched, but she forced herself not to pull back. She held his gaze. "If anything happens to Caleb, I am a widow. A widow inherits. The estate remains mine." Montgomery's smile widened, reaching his cold eyes. "Ah, but Magistrate Higgins hasn't filed the ledger with the county clerk yet. The stagecoach to the capital doesn't leave until tomorrow morning. If something were to happen to your new husband before the sun goes down and that ledger somehow caught fire, well, you wouldn't be a widow. You'd just be an unmarried orphan missing her deadline." He stood up straight, buttoning his charcoal suit jacket. "Josiah, do not file those papers yet. I believe there will be an amendment to the situation shortly." Montgomery turned and walked out of the dining room, the heavy oak doors shutting behind him, with a definitive thud. Eugene coughed nervously, reaching for the decanter. "Abby, be reasonable. Montgomery is going to ruin us if you fight him." Abigail stood up. Her legs trembled, but she locked her knees. She picked up the marriage license, folded it carefully, and slid it into her dress pocket. "Get out of my house, Eugene," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "And take your glass with you." Once the room was empty, Abigail finally let her shoulders drop. She pressed her bandaged hands to her face, a single frustrated tear escaping her tightly shut eyes. She had outmaneuvered them on paper. But out here in the real world of dirt and greed, paper didn't stop a bullet. She walked to the window, pulling back the velvet drape. The town of Oakhaven looked small from up here. Somewhere down there, Caleb Thatcher was packing his saddlebags, eager to take his gold and run back to his frozen isolation. And Montgomery's men were already hunting him. The livery stable smelled heavily of old hay, wet leather, and horse manure. It was dim, illuminated only by a few lanterns swinging gently from the rafters as the afternoon wind picked up outside. Caleb tightened the cinch on his roan gelding. The horse sidestepped, irritable from the unfamiliar confines of the stall. "Easy," Caleb murmured, patting the animal's thick neck. His saddlebags were heavy. He had spent $100 in the span of an hour. Coffee salt flour, a new iron skillet, 3 boxes of Winchester ammunition, and a heavy wool blanket. The rest of the gold, $1,900, was strapped securely in a leather belt around his waist, hidden beneath his coat. It was a fortune. It was freedom. All he had to do was swing up into the saddle ride north and let Abigail Miller handle the mess she had created. He had fulfilled his end of the bargain. He was the ghost she asked for. By the stable doors, Rust let out a low, vibrating growl. The hound stood stiff-legged, the fur on his spine standing straight up. Caleb didn't freeze. He didn't reach for his rifle in the scabbard. He simply slowed his movements. He dropped the stirrup leather, turned his back to the stall, and pulled his hunting knife from his belt in one fluid, silent motion. He slid the 7-inch blade up his sleeve, holding the handle loosely in his palm, and leaned casually against the wooden post of the stall. 2 men walked into the livery. They weren't cowboys. They wore long canvas dusters and bowler hats, city men who made their living breaking bones in back alleys. Caleb recognized the type. They thrived on fear. They were entirely unprepared for a man who thrived on survival. "You leaving already, Thatcher?" the first man asked. He was thick-shouldered with a flattened nose that had been broken several times. Caleb noted the heavy bulge beneath the man's coat. A revolver. "I bought what I needed." Caleb said, his voice flat. "Shame," the second man said. He was Lena stepping out to the left to flank Caleb, blocking the exit to the alley. "Mr. Montgomery thinks you ought to stay a while. Have a drink. Talk about annulments." "I don't drink with bankers," Caleb replied. "And I don't talk to dogs." The thick-shouldered man chuckled a wet, ugly sound. "You think you're tough because you kill bears up on that mountain hillbilly. Bears don't shoot back. You took money that doesn't belong to you, and you put your dirty hands on a woman who belongs to Mr. Montgomery." "He didn't pay you to talk to me," Caleb said. His eyes flicked between the two men, assessing distance balance and intent. "Make your move or get out of my light." The thick-shouldered man's face flushed red. He reached beneath his duster. He never cleared leather. Caleb moved with a sudden explosive violence that defied his massive size. He didn't draw a gun. He lunged forward, closing the 5-foot gap in a fraction of a second. Before the man could pull his revolver free, Caleb drove his left hand hard into the man's throat. The man gagged his eyes, going wide. Simultaneously, Caleb dropped his right arm, letting the hunting knife slide from his sleeve into his grip. He drove the heavy brass pommel of the knife directly into the man's temple. The sickening crack of bone echoed in the quiet stable. The man dropped like a sack of wet feed, instantly unconscious. The leaner man shouted, fumbling for his own weapon. Rost barked a vicious, deafening sound, snapping his jaws inches from the second man's calf. The man flinched, stepping back, thrown off balance. That hesitation was all Caleb needed. He spun, grabbing a heavy wooden pitchfork leaning against the stall. He didn't thrust it. He swung it like a baseball bat. The solid oak handle caught the lean man perfectly across the jaw. Teeth shattered. The man spun in a violent circle and collapsed into a pile of dirty hay, groaning, spitting blood, and teeth into the dirt. Caleb stood over them, his breathing perfectly even. He didn't even wipe the sweat from his brow. The violence was just a chore. Another log split, another trap set. He knelt beside the thick-shouldered man, reaching into his coat and pulling out the revolver. He tossed it into a water trough. Then he searched the man's pockets. He found a silver money clip, holding a thick wad of bills and a folded piece of paper. Caleb opened it. It was a note written in elegant, slanting cursive. "Remove the mountain man. Burn the ledger at Higgins' office. Secure the girl by sunset." Caleb stared at the paper. The ink was fresh. He slowly crushed the paper in his fist. He looked out the stable doors toward the snow-capped peak of the mountain in the distance. The wind was howling up there. It was peaceful. It was clean. It was everything he wanted. He looked down at the $1,900 strapped to his waist. It was blood money now. Caleb knew the arithmetic of the wild. A wounded animal draws predators. Abigail Miller was bleeding in the water, completely surrounded by wolves, relying on a piece of paper to act as a shield. Montgomery wasn't playing a legal game. He was playing a butcher's game. And if Caleb rode away now, knowing what he knew, Abigail wouldn't live to see the winter. Caleb cursed quietly under his breath. It was a harsh, bitter sound. He turned back to his roan gelding. He didn't loosen the cinch. Instead, he pulled his Winchester rifle from the scabbard, checked the action, and chambered around. The sharp, mechanical clack-clack of the lever was louder than thunder in the quiet stable. He grabbed the reins. "Come on, Rust." Caleb set his voice hard. "We're taking a detour." The rain began just as the sun dipped behind the western ridge, a freezing, miserable drizzle that promised to turn the town's mud into a freezing quagmire. Inside the Miller mansion, the chill was absolute. Abigail had dismissed the servants. She couldn't bear their pitying stares. She sat in the parlor, a large, dimly lit room, dominated by heavy leather furniture and walls lined with unread books. A small fire crackled in the hearth, doing little to beat back the cold. She poured herself a glass of brandy. She didn't drink. Her father had warned her about the weakness at the bottom of a bottle, but tonight she needed the fire in her throat. She stared at the amber liquid, swirling it gently. A heavy knock echoed through the empty hallway. Abigail stiffened. She set the glass down. Her father had always kept a derringer in the top drawer of his roll-top desk. She walked quietly to the study, opened the drawer, and slipped the small, heavy pistol into the pocket of her dress. Her bandaged hands throbbed as she gripped the cold metal. She walked to the front door and pulled it open just enough to see out. Elias Montgomery stood on the porch, rain dripping from the brim of his expensive hat. 2 men stood behind him, shadowy figures in the fading light. "What do you want, Elias?" Abigail demanded, keeping the heavy oak door firmly between them. "To offer my condolences," Montgomery said smoothly, pushing his hand against the door. He was stronger than he looked. The door groaned against Abigail's weight, forcing her to step back as Montgomery pushed his way into the grand foyer. "I told you to leave me alone," Abigail said, her hand tightening on the pistol in her pocket. Montgomery took off his hat, shaking the water from it onto the imported rug. He looked around the cavernous foyer, admiring the crystal chandelier and the sweeping staircase. "This is a beautiful home, Abigail," he said softly. "It requires a firm hand to maintain, a family, not a solitary grieving girl." "I am a married woman," Abigail said fiercely, "and my husband will be back." Montgomery chuckled a dark, patronizing sound. "No, my dear, he won't. I'm afraid Mr. Thatcher had a sudden change of heart. He realized the mountain air was calling him. He took his gold and ran as men of his pedigree always do. He's probably halfway up the timberline by now." Abigail's heart plummeted. The air left her lungs. Caleb was gone. Of course he was gone. She had paid him to leave. She had orchestrated her own isolation, relying on a stranger's honor in a town that had none. Montgomery took a step toward her. The 2 men behind him stepped into the foyer, shutting the front door. "Magistrate Higgins has unfortunately misplaced his ledger." Montgomery continued, his voice dropping to a silken, dangerous purr. "There is no record of a marriage today. You are unmarried. The sun is setting. By tomorrow morning, Eugene will legally control the trust, and by tomorrow afternoon, I will control Eugene." He reached out his gloved fingers, tracing the line of Abigail's jaw. She slapped his hand away violently, pulling the derringer from her pocket and leveling it at his chest. "Get out." She breathed, her voice shaking with adrenaline and sheer terror. Montgomery didn't blink. He just smiled. "You won't shoot me, Abigail. You pull that trigger, you hang for murder, and I take the estate anyway." He nodded to the 2 men behind him. "Take the gun from her. Don't bruise her face. She has to look presentable for our wedding on Sunday." The men moved forward. Abigail thumbed back the hammer of the tiny pistol. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely aim. She was cornered. The walls of her father's empire were finally crushing her. Then the front doors blew open. They didn't just open, they were violently kicked inward. The heavy oak slammed against the interior walls with a sound like a cannon shot. The custom glass panes in the doors shattered, raining down on the marble tiles. Montgomery spun around. His 2 men froze, reaching for their holsters. Caleb Thatcher stood in the doorway. He was soaked in freezing rain. Mud coated his heavy canvas coat and leather chaps. His knuckles were bruised and stained with fresh blood. In his right hand he held his Winchester rifle, resting the barrel casually over his shoulder. At his side, Rust bared his teeth, letting out a feral, deafening roar that echoed through the grand foyer. Caleb looked like a force of nature that had grown tired of the woods and decided to level a city. He stepped over the threshold, his heavy spurred boots crunching loudly on the shattered glass. He didn't look at Montgomery's men. He didn't look at Abigail. He looked dead into Elias Montgomery's eyes. "You're tracking mud onto my floor, Elias," Caleb said. The gravel in his voice scraped against the silence of the room. Montgomery paled, taking a reflexive step backward. "Thatcher, you're supposed to be gone." Caleb finished lowering the Winchester from his shoulder, letting it rest in both hands. He pumped the lever once. The brass shell casing from his earlier check flew through the air, clinking sharply on the marble. He chambered a fresh round. I forgot my wife. The two hired men exchanged a nervous glance. They had heard about what happened at the livery. They were looking at a man who had beaten two armed enforcers half to death without even drawing a gun. And now he held a rifle. "This isn't your fight, mountain man." Montgomery sneered, though his voice lacked its previous venom. "You took the money. Walk away. I'll double what she paid you." Caleb didn't negotiate. He moved. He didn't raise the rifle to fire. He simply stepped forward, grabbed the nearest hired man by the collar of his duster, and threw him with terrifying force back out the open doors, straight into the freezing mud of the driveway. The second man didn't wait to be asked. He turned and sprinted out into the rain. Caleb walked slowly toward Montgomery. The banker backed up until his spine hit the heavy wood of the staircase banister. "The ledger is burned!" Montgomery spat a desperate sweat breaking out on his forehead. "You have no proof." Caleb reached into his coat and pulled out the blood-stained note he had taken from the thick-shouldered man at the livery. He flicked it onto Montgomery's chest. "I don't need a ledger," Caleb said quietly, stepping so close Montgomery had to crane his neck up to look at him. "I'm standing right here, and if I see your face on this hill again, I won't use my hands. I'll use the rifle. Nod if you understand." Montgomery looked at the massive, scarred man in front of him. He looked at the flat, terrifying promise of death in Caleb's eyes. Montgomery swallowed hard and gave a sharp, jerky nod. "Good," Caleb said. "Get off my property." Montgomery snatched his hat from the floor and hurried out the door, stepping carefully around the broken glass, disappearing into the dark rain. The foyer fell silent, save for the howling wind blowing through the broken doors and the heavy panting of the hound. Caleb stood there for a moment, his broad back to Abigail. He slowly lowered the hammer of the Winchester. He let out a long, tired breath. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by the sheer, crushing reality of what he had just done. He had stayed. He had anchored himself to this town, to this house, to her. Abigail slowly lowered the derringer. Her legs finally gave out, and she sank onto the bottom step of the staircase, the pistol slipping from her fingers onto the rug. She looked at Caleb, staring at the mud on his boots, the blood on his hands, the massive, unmovable presence of him in her suffocating house. He turned around and looked at her. He took in her pale face, her trembling shoulders, the raw vulnerability she had tried so hard to hide. "You came back," she whispered, her voice cracking. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of sheer disbelief. Caleb walked over to his heavy saddlebags, which he had dropped on the porch, and dragged them inside. He dropped them onto the expensive Persian rug with a heavy thud. "Roof leaks up at the cabin anyway," Caleb muttered. He looked around the grand, echoing foyer, wiping the rain from his beard. "Where do you keep the coffee?" Morning in the Miller mansion felt less like a dawn and more like an autopsy. The grey light peeled back the shadows, exposing the brutalized front doors and the shattered glass scattered across the imported rugs. Caleb was awake long before the sun. Up on Iron Peak Dawn was a violent, necessary alarm clock. Down here it was just a slow creeping of light through velvet drapes. He didn't sleep in the guest room Abigail had offered. The mattress was too soft, the linen too suffocating. He had unrolled his wool blanket on the floor of the study, sleeping with his back against the mahogany desk, and his Winchester resting an inch from his right hand. He stood up, his joints popping in the cold room. The house was dead quiet. He walked into the foyer, his boots grinding against the glass dust. He grabbed a heavy iron broom from the mudroom and began to sweep. Abigail watched him from the top of the stairs. She wore a simple grey morning dress, her dark hair pulled back severely. She looked exhausted, the dark circles under her hazel eyes bruised and heavy. She watched the man who had terrified half the county perform a menial chore with the exact same focus he used to level a shotgun. He didn't look like a husband, He looked like a captive bear pacing a very expensive cage. "Leave it," she said softly, descending the stairs. "The staff will clean it." "Staff didn't break it," Caleb replied, not stopping. He swept the glass into a neat pile. "I did." He propped the broom against the wall and looked at her. Her hands were still wrapped in white linen, the bandages stained faintly pink. "Sit down," he ordered, pointing to a heavy leather chair in the foyer. Abigail stiffened, her pride flaring automatically. "I have meetings with Josiah today. I need to review the ledgers before Montgomery tries another legal maneuver." "Ledgers don't matter if your hands rot off," Caleb said. He walked past her, retrieving his saddlebags from where he had dumped them the night before. He pulled out a small wax-sealed tin and a clean strip of cotton cloth. "Sit." It wasn't a request. Abigail hesitated, then sank into the leather chair. Caleb knelt in front of her. He was too large for the delicate space, his broad shoulders blocking out the meager light from the broken door. He took her right hand. His touch was jarringly gentle. His fingers were calloused hard as cured leather, yet he unwrapped the ruined bandages with a careful, practiced precision. When the linen fell away, her palms were a mess of ruptured blisters and torn skin. Caleb didn't wince. He had seen men missing limbs. A pair of raw hands didn't faze him. He opened the tin. It smelled sharply of pine sap sulfur and crushed yarrow. "This is going to burn," he said. He scooped a measure of the thick, dark salve on 2 fingers and pressed it into her raw flesh. Abigail inhaled sharply, her whole body jerking, but Caleb held her wrist firmly. He didn't let go. The pain was sudden and blinding, a hot needle driving straight to the bone. She clamped her jaw shut, refusing to make a sound, her eyes watering. "You hold the reins too tight," Caleb said quietly, working the salve into the webbing of her fingers. "You try to control the horse with force. The animal feels the panic. It fights back. You steer with your knees. You let the leather breathe." Abigail looked down at the top of his head. His dark hair was thick overdue for a cut. "I wasn't riding for pleasure. I was riding for my life." "I know," he said. He wrapped the fresh cotton around her hand, pulling it snug, but not painfully tight. He tied it off, then took her left hand to repeat the process. "But you're down the mountain now. You can stop pulling." He finished the second hand, packed his tin away, and stood up. He didn't wait for a thank you. He walked towards the kitchen, Rust trotting faithfully at his heels. Abigail sat in the quiet foyer, staring at her freshly bandaged hands. The burning had faded, replaced by a deep, numbing heat that sank into the aches. For the first time since her father's heart gave out, she felt a microscopic fraction of the weight lift from her chest. Someone else had carried it, even just for 3 minutes. By noon, the reality of their arrangement settled in. They were 2 solitary creatures forced into the same tight perimeter. Caleb didn't belong in a parlor. When Josiah Reed, the attorney, arrived to finalize the trust paperwork, Caleb sat in the corner of the study. He didn't speak. He just sat in a wingback chair, whittling a piece of scrap cedar with his hunting knife, letting the shavings fall onto the Persian rug. Reed kept stuttering, his eyes darting nervously to the mountain man. Caleb's sheer silent presence was a physical weight in the room. It was an unspoken threat to anyone who considered crossing Abigail Miller. She realized then why she had chosen him. It wasn't just his isolation. It was his complete, unshakable indifference to the games of Oakhaven. Caleb Thatcher couldn't be bought because he didn't want anything they were selling. Elias Montgomery did not take defeat lightly. He was a man who understood that violence was messy and unpredictable, as Caleb had proven. Economics, however, were an exact science. The freeze began 3 days after the shattered doors. It started small. The grocer down in town claimed a shortage and refused to send the weekly delivery of flour and salt to the mansion. The blacksmith suddenly found himself too backlogged to shoe the Miller estate's carriage horses. Then the true blow landed. Josiah Reed arrived on a Tuesday looking entirely defeated. He didn't even flinch at Caleb whittling in the corner this time. He just dropped a leather satchel onto Abigail's desk. "The mill," Josiah said, his voice hollow. "The workers walked out this morning, all 60 of them." Abigail stood up, her jaw tightening. "Why, we pay them better than anyone in the territory." "You did," Josiah corrected. "Montgomery called in the municipal bonds. He froze the estate's line of credit at the bank. He's claiming that since the legality of the marriage is still being contested in a higher circuit court, the estate's assets are frozen pending review. I can't access the payroll accounts, Abigail. The men found out there were no wages this Friday. Montgomery's foreman told them if they walked out now, Montgomery would hire them at his own lumber yards by the end of the month." Abigail slammed her bandaged hand onto the desk. The dull pain spiked, but the anger was hotter. "He's starving them out to starve me out. If the mill stops producing, we default on the railroad contracts. If we default on the railroad, we lose the land." "We have 2 weeks before the timber quota is due," Josiah said softly. "Without a crew, it's over." Abigail sank back into her chair. The walls were closing in again. She had outrun the wolves, but Montgomery had simply built a wall around her and sat down to wait. She had the estate, the mansion, the title, and none of it mattered if she couldn't buy a loaf of bread or pay a single lumberjack. From the corner of the room, the scraping of Caleb's knife stopped. He brushed the cedar shavings from his chaps and stood up. He walked over to the desk, his boots heavy on the floorboards. He looked at the ledger, a confusing spread of red and black ink. "How much to make them pick up the axes?" Caleb asked. "It's an entire crew, Mr. Thatcher." Josiah sighed, rubbing his temples. "It's $1,200 a week in wages. The estate has it, but the bank won't release it." Caleb didn't say another word. He turned and walked out of the study. 10 minutes later, Abigail heard the heavy thud of his boots descending the front steps, followed by the clatter of a horse being saddled. He didn't ride to the bank. He rode to the logging camp at the edge of the river. The camp was a muddy, miserable stretch of canvas tents and rough-cut cabins. The massive steam-powered saws were dead quiet. Men sat around smoking hand-rolled cigarettes, whittling looking sullen and bored. They were hard men. Fallers, buckers, and teamsters. They didn't care about town politics. They cared about meat on the table and whiskey in the glass. When Caleb rode into the center of the camp, conversation stopped. They knew who he was. Some of them had bought pelts from him years ago. They watched him pull his roan to a halt outside the foreman's cabin. The foreman, a heavy-set man named Briggs, with a thick mustache and an ugly scar across his cheek, stepped out onto the porch. He crossed his arms. "You're lost, Thatcher," Briggs called out. "Timberline's about 3,000 feet higher." "Saws are quiet," Caleb noted, ignoring the jibe. "Ain't no money to make 'em loud." Briggs spat into the mud. "Montgomery says the Miller girls' accounts are locked. We don't swing axes for charity." Caleb dismounted. He reached into his heavy canvas coat and unbuckled the leather money belt from his waist. He walked up the steps to the porch. Briggs tensed his hand, dropping toward the revolver at his hip. Caleb didn't draw a weapon. He simply dropped the heavy leather belt onto the wooden railing. It hit with a solid metallic crunch. "Open it," Caleb said. Briggs frowned, glancing at the men gathering around the porch. He untied the leather strap. His eyes widened. The belt was packed tight with $20 gold pieces. $1,900. Solid, undeniable, and entirely untethered from Elias Montgomery's bank. "Montgomery pays you in paper," Caleb said, his voice carrying over the quiet crowd of loggers. "Paper burns. Banks lock their doors. This is gold. It spends anywhere." Briggs looked up from the gold, staring at Caleb. "This is a week and a half's wages. What happens after that?" "After that, the railroad pays the contract and you get your normal wage," Caleb said flatly. "You sit in the mud and wait for Montgomery, you're beggars. You swing the axes today, you're paid in full tonight." Caleb didn't wait for a debate. He didn't give a rousing speech about loyalty to Arthur Miller. These men didn't care about Arthur Miller. They cared about the gold sitting on the railing. He turned around, walked down the steps, and swung back up onto his horse. "I like the sound of the saws, Briggs," Caleb said, looking down at the foreman. "Start them up." By the time Caleb rode back onto the Miller estate, the distant rhythmic shriek of the steam saws was echoing through the river valley. The freeze was broken, not with lawyers, not with ledgers, but with mountain logic. When he walked back into the foyer, Abigail was waiting. She had heard the saws. She looked at him, her hazel eyes wide with a mix of shock and profound gratitude. "You paid them," she breathed, "with the money I gave you." Caleb walked past her, pulling his hat off and shaking the river mist from the brim. "Wasn't doing me any good sitting in a belt." "Caleb," she said, stepping in front of him, forcing him to stop. "You bought my freedom, again." "Why?" He looked down at her. The harshness in his face softened just a fraction. "A man shouldn't keep a dog he can't feed, and a town shouldn't cage a woman it can't break. You aren't broken, Abigail." Winter arrived, not with a whisper but with a hammer blow. A blizzard descended on Oakhaven in late November, burying the town in 3 feet of snow over a single night. The Miller mansion, for all its opulence, was draughty. The high ceilings trapped the cold air, and the sprawling rooms felt cavernous and dead. The servants had been dismissed for the week, trapped in their own homes down in the valley. It was just Abigail, Caleb, and the hound. They retreated to the study, the only room small enough to heat effectively. Caleb had built a roaring fire in the stone hearth, stacking seasoned oak high against the iron grate. Abigail sat on the rug near the flames, wrapped in a heavy quilt. The bandages were finally off her hands, leaving behind pale, fresh scars. She watched Caleb. He was sitting in the leather chair, meticulously cleaning his rifle, the smell of gun oil cutting through the scent of wood smoke. They had existed in this strange, silent orbit for 2 months. Montgomery had backed off, nursing his wounds, waiting for a vulnerability that never came. The mill was running. The estate was secure. The town had accepted with grudging, fearful respect that Caleb Thatcher was not a ghost. He was the wall around the Miller empire, but inside the wall the contract still hung over them. Abigail pulled her gaze away from his hands and looked into the fire. "You could go back now," she said softly. Caleb paused. His thumb rested on the heavy brass receiver of the Winchester. He looked up. "Excuse me. The estate is secure. The railroad contract paid out yesterday? Montgomery is out of moves." She pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders, feeling a sudden deep chill that had nothing to do with the blizzard outside. "The terms of our agreement are fulfilled. I can have Josiah draft the remaining $3,000 to whatever bank you want. You don't have to sleep on a floor anymore." Caleb set the rifle down. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his dark eyes locked onto her. "Are you firing me, Abigail? I am releasing you." She corrected, her voice trembling slightly. "You hate this town. You hate the noise, the people to the walls. You traded your mountain to save my life. I won't hold you hostage to a piece of paper." Caleb stared at her for a long, heavy moment. The wind howled against the window panes, rattling the glass. "I left this town 12 years ago," Caleb said, his gravelly voice dropping lower. It was the most he had spoken at once since they met. "My younger brother Thomas caught a fever. Lung sickness. We had a small farm out on the eastern ridge. We needed a doctor. We needed medicine. The bank Montgomery's father foreclosed on our plow horses because we missed one payment. The doctor wouldn't ride out without cash up front." Abigail stopped breathing. She just listened. "Thomas died in a bed that felt like ice." Caleb continued, his eyes drifting to the flames. "I buried him in the dirt, and then I packed a bag and walked up Iron Peak. I realized that a mountain might kill you, but it won't lie to you. It won't smile to your face and take your horses in the dark. It just is." He looked back at Abigail. "I spent 12 years keeping the world out," he said. Because people break contracts. People fail. But then a woman rode up a washed-out trail in a velvet dress, freezing to death, and looked me in the eye and didn't ask for pity. She asked for a fight. Caleb stood up. He walked over to the desk, opened the top drawer, and pulled out a heavy, folded document. The marriage license. The contract. He walked back to the fire and stood over her. "You asked me to be a ghost," Caleb said. "To sign a paper and disappear." He tossed the marriage license directly into the roaring flames. Abigail gasped, instinctively reaching out, but the dry parchment caught instantly. It curled, blackened, and turned to ash in a matter of seconds. The only proof of their legal bind gone. The estate, the inheritance, everything rested on a pile of grey flakes. She looked up at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. "What did you just do?" "I don't do business, Abigail," Caleb said softly. He knelt down in front of her, matching her level on the rug. He reached out his large, scarred hand, gently cupping the side of her face. His thumb brushed against her jawline. It was a terrifyingly intimate gesture from a man built of iron and wood. "I told you that on the mountain. I'm not a hired gun, and I'm not a ghost." Abigail looked into his eyes. There was no cynicism left, no anger, just a deep, profound, anchoring force. He wasn't staying for the money. He wasn't staying for the fight. "So why are you staying?" she whispered, leaning the smallest fraction into his palm. "Because my wife is here," Caleb said. The wind shrieked against the mansion, but inside the study the cold finally broke. Abigail reached up her scarred hands, wrapping around his thick wrist, pulling him closer. The Wild West had tried to cage her and freeze him out. But as he kissed her a slow, deep, claiming that tasted of wood smoke and survival, she realized they had done the impossible. They hadn't just survived the wolves. They had tamed the mountain. A marriage built on survival just became a partnership built on blood ash and defiance. Caleb and Abigail didn't just beat Oakhaven's greed, they burned the rules and wrote their own. Sometimes the strongest love stories aren't found in a ballroom, but forged in the freezing mud by two people who refuse to break. If this gritty, grounded Western romance hooked you, hit that like button right now. Share this story with someone who loves a truly fierce hero and an unbreakable heroine. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next epic tale. Stay wild, and we'll see you in the next one.